Hope y'all had a good weekend. Um, don't forget that tonight your vocabulary short story was already due, but the recording of it is due tonight before 11:59 p.m. Don't forget that. The instructions are on Google Classroom, so you should already know what to do. But you just record it, um, put it on YouTube, and then under the assignment where it says "Add class comment," put the link there. It needs to be activity we're going to do later this week. So make sure you review the instructions for how to get that submitted correctly so you don't lose any points for not following directions. Let's go ahead and get started with our content for today. What I would recommend doing before we do anything else, especially if you've not already recorded your vocabulary short story yet, go back and look at the vocabulary words for delivery. This is kind of misleading wording. It says for each vocabulary word, each of the vocabulary short story, but this really means like for each like delivery word. So it's like for pronunciation, for articulation, for volume, for tone, etc. You define that word. It's like, okay, for volume, define it. It's the how loud or how soft your voice is. Then give a good example of it. It's like, okay, like if my audience can all hear me and I sound confident because I'm projecting well, that's a good example. A bad example would be talking too loudly or talking too softly where my audience can't hear me. And then explain when you would modify it. That would be like, okay, why would I want to modify or change my volume in my speech? Okay, well, if I'm telling a story and then there's a loud sound, I might raise my volume to like match that same kind of volume increase in my story. So I would say go back and do that for each of your vocabulary words to make sure you have a good grasp of them. We are a pretty good way of them out through Unit 4, and we will have a test on it. So just make sure you have a good understanding of all the content. It's probably some kind of review we'll do later on. So it's better to go ahead and do it now. Make sure you have a good understanding of it. And it's also going to help with the activity we're going to do. Today, what we're going to learn about is something called constructive criticism. I think that we're not really often taught how to give criticism well, and we're also just not taught how to receive it well. And so we can have kind of this negative taste in our mouth about criticism. And so it's really important for us to know how important it is for us to receive, but also how important it is to make sure we give it properly. And when we know how to give it properly, it also kind of in turn helps us receive it well. If we know people are trying to give criticism in the best way possible, they just probably don't know how either. So to understand what kind of things constructive criticism has to take up, let's break down those two words. So the word constructive, I think of like construction. So when you think of construction, you probably think of like a construction site. So something being built. Well, that's what constructive means. It's something that's useful. It's something that's building up. So maybe when you were little, if you said something that was mean, your mom would be like, okay, is that constructive? And it's like, no. So she means like, okay, is that helpful? Is that building someone up? And so the word constructive means serving a useful purpose, tending to build up. Okay, so it's interesting that criticism needs to be useful and needs to build others up. That's interesting though, because we can think of criticism as kind of like only negative, like, hey, you did this wrong, or hey, you're bad at this. But it has to be constructive, so it has to build up. That's interesting. So the criticism is an analysis and judgment of the merits, so the good parts, and faults of a work. So like you may be doing like some kind of like criticism of, okay, for like a food critic or like a movie critic, they don't only point out the faults of a piece of food or like a restaurant or a movie, they talk about the merits as well. We tend to receive criticism only as like a bad thing, so only talking about the faults and the downside, but it's actually both. And so for good constructive criticism, it needs to acknowledge the shortcomings of a speech. For sure, it needs to say, hey, like, here's where you fell short, but also needs to serve the purpose of giving direction and instruction as to what can be done differently. So it's like if you're telling someone what they did wrong and you're not really giving them direction on how to improve, it's not really useful. So that's a really good way we can know that we can give constructive criticism well is by saying, okay, yeah, like we give them the merit, say, hey, you did great here. And then we say, hey, well, here's how you could do better. Like you didn't do this super well. So I'm going to give you instruction on what to fix. So if you're giving a speech and maybe your your tone of voice, maybe it didn't really appropriately match the emotion that your words were trying to convey. Maybe you're telling a sad story, but your tone is really upbeat. If someone just gives you a piece of paper and it says tone, well, you may not really know what they're telling you to fix. And so you need to make sure that you don't just point out the fault, but you give instruction as to how they can improve next time. So these are some bad examples of constructive criticism. If you just tell someone, eye contact. Okay, well, what about the eye contact? Did they stare way too long at just one person? Or did they stare at the floor? Or was the eye contact really quick? Or did they not make any eye contact at all? Like, don't leave it open for interpretation. You should tell them, hey, your eye contact wasn't great because of this specific thing. Here is the direction I'm going to give you on how to fix it. Even if you put the word bad in front of it, say, oh, bad posture. Okay, what was bad about it though? Like, was I slouching or did I only face one side of the audience? Because remember, when we watched those Victor Antonio videos and we talked about posture, it's not just standing up straight, it's just the relative position of your body to your audience. So, a lot of things will be bad about your posture. So, you have to get specific and then also give instruction as to how to fix it in the future. Even if you tell someone something they did well, if you're saying, hey, good tone, okay, what was good about it? Because I may have thought that I was changing up my tone a lot. Maybe you thought that my tone was like consistent, and that's what you liked about it. So you make sure, hey, like, don't leave things up for interpretation. Make sure it's really clear to them. And lastly, change volume. It may sound like you're giving a direction, but like that's again kind of really vague. Like, do you want me to change it by being louder or change it by being quieter? So these expressions don't tell a speaker what they can do to improve. So they don't really give that direction and instruction. So it's not as clear as it could be. And if it's not being clear, it's not being useful. These would be better examples of constructive criticism. If you say, eye contact was great, not too quick, but didn't linger. So you're telling them what specifically you like about it. If you say, don't slouch over the podium, stand up straight, you're giving them that very clear direction of like, hey, don't do this, do that. Because even though you're saying don't slouch over the podium, like it may seem obvious what the alternative thing is to do, it may not be that obvious. If it was obvious, they would do it. So instead of just saying don't slouch over the podium, say stand up straight as well. Because again, like it may seem obvious, okay, what's the opposite of don't slouch over the podium? Stand up straight. Okay. But again, if it were obvious, they would be doing it. And then again, good tone changes. Next time, try to change your tone more to add emphasis on certain words. And so it gives that further instruction on how to keep improving. So the key words we're looking for are next time and try. So we put that right there. Actually, next time, try. So they're both there. Because those are how you're going to know that you're for sure giving them some kind of direction or instruction. So in this example, like where it says don't slouch over the podium, stand up straight, it can be made even better if it said don't slouch over the podium, next time stand up straight or try to stand up straight, just to make sure you're being like extra careful to try and include that direction and instruction. But this is a pretty fail-safe thing to do. So like honestly, that's what I look for as I'm grading constructive criticism evaluations or peer critiques as we're going to call them, because that's how I know like you've given them a direction or instruction. So like you should be using these keywords. So use next time and try because you're telling them specifically what they can do differently. Avoid maybe do this, and if you want, because you say maybe change your tone, or if you want stand up straight, that makes it very optional. It's diminishing the value and necessity of your constructive criticism. And so if you're saying like, oh, stand up straight if you want, it's like, okay, well, I don't want to. I like slouching. So it's like, okay, sorry. What I meant by that was stand up straight. So don't use those wishy-washy words. I think a lot of people are uncomfortable giving criticism just because, like I said earlier, not everyone takes it well. So it feels like you're being rude. But I'm going to show you here in a minute what we do to kind of like soften the blow of receiving constructive criticism and how to give it in a nice way so you don't have to worry about adding these wishy-washy words in. But just be firm. Like you're trying to help them be a better speaker. You're not being mean at all. And then last thing is that sometimes you may be giving a constructive criticism evaluation or a peer critique to a speaker or a student who is a really good speaker, and you may have a hard time thinking of things they need to improve on. But the perfect speaker doesn't exist. So, like, remember when we talked about speech anxiety? There are better and worse ways to speak, but there's not one right or wrong way. So that means that there's not one ultimate perfect way of speaking, and we're not going to attain that someday. So even if someone has really mastered like one way of speaking, you can give them challenges to try another way. Um, so like for example, here it says, "Great posture. You were so relaxed. Next time I challenge you to walk around the room more." So maybe they stood very still. They didn't rock back and forth or shift weight. So you're challenging them to add some purposeful movement in. And so if you have a speaker who's done really, really well and you can't think of anything they need to improve on necessarily, then give them a challenge. So remember the growth mindset. You don't want to put them in the fixed mindset, being like, "Wow, you're so good and perfect. Like, don't change a thing." No, like challenge them, help them to keep improving and getting better. I want to show y'all the peer critique form that we use for this class and for college public speaking. Um, so this is what it looks like for our class and for the seniors as well. So it says oral communication peer critique. On this side, it's the speaker. And so can't think of any famous speakers right now. I'm blanking. So whoever is like, maybe let's say that Keith McDaniel is a speaker in chapel and you're doing a peer critique over him. So you would type Keith McDaniel right here because he is the one who is speaking. Then for the critiquer, that is you, and you'll write your own name. It's important for us to put our names with our work because we need accountability. So you can't just write whatever you want. It's not like there's going to be consequences, but like you do get a grade for these, and we don't want to get that sense of kind of like feeling anonymous that some people get behind keyboards where they feel like they can say whatever they want. We do not want to get that way. We want to realize that we are accountable for our words, and we want to try and remember that we are trying to be encouraging to our speakers and not tear them down and be mean. So we will put our names on these. It is not anonymous. And then you will write whatever the speech assignment is. So like, for example, y'all are going to do a peer critique, I believe tomorrow, so Tuesday, over this speaker named Phil Davison, and it's called Peer Critique Practice. And so you'll write Phil Davison right here next to speaker. You'll put your name next to critiquer. And for speech assignment, you'll put peer critique practice. And now here are the instructions for the peer critique form. For credit, comment on 3 areas of strength and 3 areas of improvement for the speaker. So just to clarify, 3 areas of strength. So should put 3 separate things in this area that they did well. And then 3 areas of improvement. So 3 separate things that they need to improve on. I highlighted it, so it seems pretty clear, but for some reason, even seniors sometimes only put 1 or 2. I'm a communication person, but I can count. I think y'all can too. And so, 3 things that they did well, 3 things they could improve on. Not just what they did, but what specifically they can do differently next time. So again, like if they had a really good attention getter, don't just put attention getter. You need to actually say, your attention getter was really good. I like the way you asked a question and made me feel involved and captured my attention really quickly. Or if they need to do something better, don't just say thesis. Or don't say thesis was unclear. So don't just say what they did, but what specifically they can do differently next time. You will not get credit. So notice it says for credit. So you will not get credit if you don't put 3 areas of strength, 3 areas of improvement, and then also what specifically they can do differently next time. And now you don't need to do this part for the strengths because like if they had a good attention getter, hopefully they'll keep it up. But for the needs improvement, they need to know how to improve on it. So don't just say what they did poorly, say what specifically they can do differently next time. You must, I'm going to highlight that in fact. I'm going to bold it, and I'm going to underline it, and I'm going to make it orange. Must, so that means it's required. You must use words like keywords like next time and try. And again, not for strengths because you're telling them what they did well. And then avoid maybe and if you want. Now, the reason we don't have to say like maybe and if you want is because like you've already done the nice part. Like, someone told me once there's kind of this sandwich method of giving someone criticism where like you start like the sandwich pieces are like compliments and strengths, and then The middle of the sandwich is like the criticism. So you might say, hey, your attention getter was really awesome. Good job getting our attention with a story. However, your thesis was a little unclear and hard to follow. But again, you did really well with the attention getter, and you also had a really strong and clear ethos. So it's kind of like, okay, you start and end with something good. In the middle, you put something kind of like negative. So like we've already given the person like areas that they've done really well on. Like we've given them their strengths. It's like we've said the nice part. So when you get over here, you don't have to be wishy-washy. You don't have to be afraid of speaking truth to them. Like people need to hear the truth. We're not being loving towards them by like concealing this information and letting them go on being a bad speaker or whatever they're doing wrong. Like think back to the Johari window stuff. Like we need people's feedback. We need fellowship. And so this is important. You can't just keep those comments to yourself if it's something that's going to help the other person grow and get better. So like you already told them their strengths. You did the nice part. You can like be real over here. You can say, hey, your thesis was unclear. I didn't know what your main points were. Next time, make sure your 3 points are nice and distinct in your thesis. Cool. Like you're not telling them like they're ugly and you hate them. Like you're just saying, hey, here's something you didn't do really well, but here's how you can fix it. So use next time and try, avoid maybe and if you want. What we're going to do now, we are going to do a fun bingo game. Before we do the bingo game, though, there are a few things we need to go through because there's kind of like some vocabulary you'll need to get for the bingo game. Some of these you're probably, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to explain one thing. So this middle column is what I'm actually about to explain. So it says what to look for. So obviously, you're only doing 3 and 3, so it's 6 total. There's a lot more than 6 words here, so you don't have to comment on every single one of these. That math does not add up. But it's just like what to look for. It's kind of like things you can look out for as you're watching a speech or listening to a speech to give you an idea of what to give criticism about. Most of these y'all probably already know what they are just from like your English classes. So like your attention getter sounds like what it is, getting someone's attention. Strong introduction. Your thesis, it's like the main central argument for your whole speech or essay. It has like your 3 main points in it. Ethos, that means like that you're establishing that you are trustworthy as a speaker. Relevance, y'all know what it means for something to be relevant, if it's relatable to you, if it matters. For your preview, that's just a more specific version of the thesis. It's like my thesis might be like my 3 main points, and my preview is going to have subpoints. So the subpoints refer to the main points. This isn't super important, but it's just like going to help you with the bingo a little bit, I would think. Strong main points, organization, transitions between the main points, blah, 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 things. Extemporaneous, we talked about that already when we talked about different settings, but that just means that it's not memorized, but you're not reading right off the script either. And you know all these things from delivery. And none of these are super, super important to know for the bingo game, but just a lot of students will be like, oh, wait, I don't know what that word means. And I'm like, okay, well, you don't really need to know what it means to see that it's on your bingo board, but some of y'all will ask anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and tell you. What I want y'all to do now, I want y'all to go to this link right here, the bit.ly/3a bingo. It should be on your slide as well. So you're going to go to this website, and it's going to open up a little bingo board for you. And I'm going to start calling out I'm going to call for like, oh, a good example of tone. But your board isn't going to say a good example of tone. It's going to have an actual good example. So for example, let's say that I'll go ahead and go through the first one with y'all. So let's say that the first one is going to be a bad example of constructive criticism about an attention getter. So look at your board for a second and try and see if there's a bad example of constructive criticism about an attention getter. It may not be there, but it might be there. All right, so what you would see on your bingo board if you had this one, so if I asked for a bad example of constructive criticism about an attention getter, you would be marking on your bingo board, attention getter was boring. So if your bingo board says attention getter was boring, go ahead and mark that off because that's the bad example of constructive criticism about an attention getter. If your board says next time use a fact or a story as an attention getter, that would be a good example of constructive criticism about an attention getter. And so hopefully you can see the differences between those two. And so if I ask for a bad example about the attention getter, it says attention getter was boring. So that doesn't tell them how they can improve. It doesn't say next time or try. So that's not good. So the good example says next time use a fact or story as an attention getter. So that's what we're looking for here. All right. We're gonna go ahead and just continue through the rest of the game. What we're gonna do when you finish, so I'm gonna call out 25 as like bingo call outs. When you finish, you're gonna take a picture or a screenshot of your bingo board and you're gonna submit it in the corresponding place, like the assignment on Google Classroom. Yeah, and that's it. Bonus points for students who actually get a bingo. So if you don't get a bingo, it's totally fine. I will be going back and checking, so you will lose points if you like don't put the right thing, or if you have like a bingo but it's not words that I actually called. So I am going to go back and look at those. But you'll get full credit if you have things checked on there that even if like you don't get a bingo, you'll still get full credit. You just get extra credit if you get a bingo. So let's play. So if you already have a good example and a bad example of attention getter, go ahead and mark those off. For our next one, we're going to do a bad example of constructive criticism about the thesis statement. A bad example of constructive criticism about the thesis statement. Next, we need a good example of constructive criticism about an ethos. A good example of constructive criticism about an ethos. Now again, ethos just means that they are trustworthy or credible and they've proved that to our audience, so that doesn't really matter to get the bingo. Next, we need a bad example of constructive criticism about relevance. Bad example of constructive criticism about relevance. Next, we need a good example of constructive criticism about a preview. A good example of constructive criticism about a preview. Next, we need a bad example of constructive criticism about main points. A bad example of constructive criticism about main points. Next, we need a good example of constructive criticism about organization. A good example of constructive criticism about organization. Next, we need a bad example of constructive criticism about citing sources. A bad example of constructive criticism about citing sources. Next, we need a good example of constructive criticism about transitions. A good example of constructive criticism about transitions. Next, we need a bad example of constructive criticism about tone. A bad example of constructive criticism about tone. Next, we need a good example of constructive criticism about tone. We need a good example of constructive criticism about tone. Next, we need a bad example of constructive criticism about appearance. A bad example of constructive criticism about appearance. Next, we need a good example of constructive criticism about eye contact. A good example of constructive criticism about eye contact. Next, we need a bad example of constructive criticism about gestures. A bad example of constructive criticism about gestures. I feel like I may have misspoke just then, so just to clarify, a bad example of constructive criticism about gestures. The more I read these, the more I can't remember if I've said a good example or bad example, which is why I type them out so y'all can see. We need a bad example of constructive criticism about gestures. And now we need a good example of constructive criticism about posture. A good example of constructive criticism about posture. Next, we need a bad example of constructive criticism about rate. Next, we need a good example of constructive criticism about volume. A good example of constructive criticism about volume. Next, we need a bad example of constructive criticism about vocal fillers. A bad example of constructive criticism about vocal fillers. Next, we need a good example of constructive criticism about facial expressions. A good example of constructive criticism about facial expressions. Next, we need a bad example of constructive criticism about transitions. A bad example of constructive criticism about transitions. Next, we need a good example of constructive criticism about appearance. A good example of constructive criticism about appearance. Next, we need a bad example of constructive criticism about posture. A bad example of constructive criticism about posture. Next, we need a good example of constructive criticism about main points. A good example of constructive criticism about main points. And I believe this is the last one. We need a bad example of constructive criticism about facial expressions. A bad example of constructive criticism about facial expressions. All right, and that's all we have for today. So go ahead and if you haven't already, um, You need to record your vocabulary short story, review the instructions on how to get that submitted and where to submit it. Maybe consider reviewing the delivery words before you do that. Refresh yourself on constructive criticism. We just learned about it. Do the bingo. Hopefully you've already done it, or else it probably was a very boring last like 10 minutes of me slowly reading those out. Do the bingo board, and then screenshot it or take a picture, submit it to the place on Google Classroom. This board is going to be due, we'll say Tuesday before 11:59 p.m. But it's bingo, so it shouldn't take you very long at all. That's all we've got for today, and tomorrow we'll just do a fun little activity. Have a great rest of your day.